It's been said before that civilization is 9 meals away from anarchy. Nothing brings out the primal beast more than the deprivation of our basic human needs. When people become hungry, they lose their capacity to reason. When a person goes without food for an extended period of time, the finer workings of their cerebral cortex, that part of our brain which allowed us to build civilization, becomes greatly diminished, and our lower, more animalistic brain gets into the driver's seat and takes control. When people are deprived of food, ethics and morality goes out the window. And unlike many impoverished and underdeveloped countries, in the Western world the standard for nutrient consumption is very high. This will only deepen the sense of entitlement to a good meal when times get tough. Once faced with this foreign sense of hunger that many in our society have never experienced, many people will go into panic mode. When it came down to one family's survival over another, the true selfish nature of human beings will manifest. People who've never had to starve will be accelerated into ravenous mobs of entitled misfits, tearing each other apart for the last morsels of food. And when the food is gone, many will turn on each other. For this reason, the zombie metaphor that is commonly used to describe these sort of situations is not far off. We are literally talking about neurologically compromised hordes of people who are seeking to feed. If that's not a zombie, I don't know what is. There's a variety of anomalous events which could lead to a rapid disruption in the global food supply. Things such as electromagnetic pulse, global conflict, pandemic, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and cybersecurity threats to the power grid are all serious events that would have grave consequences on the global food supply chain. But the threats we are going to talk about today are ones which specifically deal with our ability to produce enough food to feed everyone on the planet. And if you question the plausibility of any of the scenarios that I'm going to lay out today, ask yourself why millions of dollars have been invested to bury nearly 1 million seeds deep into an icy mountain of Norway in the Svalbard seed vault. This seed vault is built to last 200 years. It is built to withstand earthquakes, nuclear war. Even if the entirety of the northern ice cap melt, it will still be safe and above sea level. It's buried in the permafrost. And there's also a reason why Norway does not allow any genetically modified crops into this facility. We'll talk more about that later. But keep this in mind at all times, that there is a concerted effort around the world to stockpile the biodiversity that took nature millions of years to create. Because these threats that I'm going to discuss today are very real. As resilient and innovative as we are as a species, the following risk factors pose a grave existential threat to our civilization. As of 2011, an American adult consumes nearly 2,000 pounds of food per year. If every human being in the world ate like this, we would have run out of fresh water nearly 15 years ago. We would also run out of land. In order to feed the rest of the world to the current USDA dietary standard, an additional gigahectare of arable land would be required. That's the equivalent of the size of Canada, which is the second largest country in the world. As developing countries continue to develop, so do their appetites. And these increasingly high-calorie diets are putting more and more stress on the agricultural system. Nearly 1 billion people in developing countries spend 80 to 90% of their income just for food. By contrast, in Western society, we only spend 10%. But that can all change really fast as food prices are projected to continue to rise. Disposable incomes dwindle and people take to the streets and protest. And the intensity of these protests is only going to escalate. We've seen it happen in the Arab Spring. Food prices went through the roof and people revolted. The only question is, who's next? Eventually, people will be compelled to take action. When the price of a brand new TV costs the same amount as a couple days worth of healthy food, something is seriously wrong with the system. The world's increased appetite is going to require more land, more water, more energy, and will cause more pollution. It's projected that by 2050, we're going to have to double our agricultural output. This means that this is going to doubly intensify all of the risk factors that I'm going to go over today. Even right now, the human race's management of its food supply is unsustainable. Now double that and see what happens. There is no other way for this to end but in disaster. Consider that for the better part of human civilization, less than 5% of people lived in urban areas. At a rapid pace throughout the last 100 years, 54% of the world now lives in an urbanized environment, many in heavily polluted, toxic megalopolises. And this number is expected to grow to 68% by 2050. That's nearly 1 billion more people living in these congested conglomerations in a span of 30 years. What this means is that people are going to be increasingly removed from their ability to grow their own foods. The horticultural skills which got humanity through the ages will be all but lost, as the overwhelming majority of people who were reared in an urban environment couldn't forage, hunt, or grow food if their lives depended on it. This increased urbanization has led to something called the just-in-time delivery system. Prior to all the various revolutions of transport, be they by sea or rail, semi-trailer or air cargo, marketplaces kept very large surpluses of goods on hand, because you never knew when the next train is going to be coming. But now many supermarkets don't have inventory in the back room. In fact, there are no back rooms anymore, because it's far more cost effective for these places to have the food shipped in as it's needed in a just-in-time manner than have to pay for all the extra square footage that would be required to store that food on hand. Everything arrives just in the nick of time. Advancements in computing mean that when something is out of stock, it's immediately shipped out and replaced. This system works excellent while there's gasoline to burn and electricity flowing through the power grid, but is the absolute worst system you could have if you're talking about weathering a long-term grid down situation. There is barely enough food on hand in any city to feed that city for a week. Most grocery stores will run out of food within the first 72 hours. And that's an optimistic estimate. That's presuming that there are limits set on how much customers can purchase. Because if people know that the power is going to be down for a prolonged period of time, they're going to buy as much as they possibly can. Don't be deceived into thinking that there's enough food in these grocery stores to go around. There isn't. If everybody in your city went shopping today, there would be food shortages by the afternoon. The system relies on the fact that not everybody is going to get groceries at once, very similar to a bank run. There's projected to be 9.8 billion people by the year 2050. More people with higher standards. More people who want to eat meat. This higher demand for meat means that there's a greater potential for the spread of pathogens in livestock. This is due to increased pressures on factory farms to make more meat faster and cheaper than before. It's likely that the push for plant-based proteins is going to continue as people in developing countries start eating more meat like their Western counterparts. To put this in perspective, it requires 30 times the amount of land to get 1 kilogram of beef protein as it does 1 kilogram of plant protein. The reality is, as indicated before, there simply is not enough arable land to provide the entire world with the American diet. And the more we move towards that end, the greater the existential threats to the agricultural system begin to mount, which we are now going to discuss. And it's not only our domesticated livestock that come under threat by the superbug. The more we keep gambling with factory farming, the greater the likelihood that a highly virulent strain of avian influenza, or one emerging from another livestock variant, is going to make a jump to humans, and nature is going to force the population of human beings into decline. With increasing regularity and intensity, there are more and more outbreaks of bird flu and livestock diseases, which beyond decimate domestic animal populations. When this happens, all of that meat is wasted. These commercial poultry farms are a disaster waiting to happen. They are disease incubators. They're dark, they're humid, and they have very crowded conditions. The birds within them have lowered immunity, and there's very little genetic diversity and thus ability to form resistance to pathogens. There has been noted to be an inverse relationship between the accelerated growth and disease resistance. This means that faster growing birds are far more susceptible to illness. Because we can now grow a chicken twice as fast as we could 50 years ago, all the more vulnerable we've become to these super pathogenic threats. The factory farming system is a ticking time bomb, and the real problem is that it's only accelerating. All of the things that I just mentioned are being practiced with greater frequency and intensity year over year. Although in the last couple years avian influenza has been relatively quiet, it was only in 2015 that the US Department of Agriculture had to declare a state of emergency due to an outbreak that required the culling of 50 million birds across several states. This impact was felt worldwide as many other countries struggled with the same problem. Much of this can be blamed on the current economic system, which sees an industry that's driven by greed, one in which many farmers become victims and are indebted to banks and corporations to continue making ends meet, while haphazardly propagating this system in which most scientists agree creates the conditions as such that it's only a matter of time before another plague is amongst us. As evidenced in the current situation in Venezuela, where widespread civil unrest as a result of political instability has led to a rapid inflation of the currency and food shortages, economic instability, embargoes, trade wars, as well as the prices of related commodities such as oil, all have the capability to inflate the cost of food. Everything is related. If the cost of oil goes up, so does the cost of food. Every calorie of food requires 10 calories of oil to make. If there's a conflict that ensues that impacts the price of oil, the price of food follows suit. The move towards a just-in-time delivery system means that more and more energy is required to produce less and less. This seems counterintuitive, because one would think that as the system becomes more efficient, we should be able to grow and distribute food at lower cost and lower energy expenditure. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Back in the 1940s, we were able to produce 2.3 calories worth of energy with the investment of only 1 calorie. Now it takes nearly 10 calories of oil to produce only 1 calorie of food. It used to be that we had a net 1.3 caloric gain, so why then is the food distribution system 2,000 times more inefficient than it was 70 years ago? Back in the 1940s, for every barrel of oil that we invested into oil extraction, we were able to harvest 100 barrels of oil. Today, it requires 10 barrels of oil to harvest that same 100 barrels of oil. This is a decline of nearly 1,000% in mining efficiency. As the cost of oil has increased, this of course has ramifications for the cost of food and how much energy it takes to produce and distribute. As we become more and more urbanized and we become ever more reliant on the harder to reach reserves of oil, this problem is only going to escalate. And while there have been some minor advancements and innovations by way of renewable energy based agriculture, they always come up short and are still locked into the same paradigm, which relies heavily on pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, and is extremely wasteful at every stage between the farm and the plate. Big corporations have an oligopoly over agriculture, and they make it much harder for small-scale producers to compete. Because these corporations have deep pockets, good legal teams, lobby groups, and politicians in their back pocket, much of the regulatory framework that surrounds the agricultural system comes at no extra cost and in many cases great benefit to these corporations. However, these increasing regulations have made it nearly impossible for the family farm to compete, and thus is quickly going the way of the dinosaur. There's so much regulation that even if a person did want to grow their own food, it becomes increasingly more difficult to do with the government hovering overhead. One of the main pillars of the Green Revolution that transformed agriculture in the 1950s and 60s was the widespread use of pesticides in order to suppress insect populations which would otherwise decimate crops. Since then, pesticide use has become the norm and it's only increased year over year. In spite of a relatively recent movement which seeks to curtail the use of pesticides, Pesticide use is still up 29% since the year 2000, a time when it was already being used in haphazard amounts. The problem with pesticides are multifold. Not only do they have the negative impact of killing a lot of the other insects which are not intended to be killed, like the bees and other pollinators that our crops rely on, but it's said that nearly 98% of all the pesticides sprayed reach a destination other than their target species. As such, water runoff can carry these pesticides into grazing areas for livestock, and probably more importantly, human settlements. This also leads to a problem called bioamplification. Toxicity compounds up the food chain. For example, if you have a bunch of little fish ingesting a toxic substance, the fish that eat those fish become even more toxic, and the fish that eat those fish become even more toxic, and human beings tend to eat the fish at the top end of the food chain, like tuna. Hence the common problem of mercury poisoning. We'll talk more about overfishing later. The fact is that pesticides only work for so long. Pests will evolve and mutate and become resistant to the pesticides sprayed, and thus pesticides must be constantly fortified or rotated in order to hold back these super pests. This can lead to widespread crop loss as it has in recent years. For example, a new strain of super pest is called the diamondback moth. It is already resistant to a whole class of common pesticides, and due to shorter winters, its numbers are remaining very high. This is causing resurgences the next year, which are even greater than the year before. This is but one of many super pests that pose a threat to our food supply. The problem of pests and pesticides is compounded by the use of herbicides. In the same way that more and more pesticides must be used, herbicides must increase in their potency year over year to combat increasingly more adaptive superweeds. Another part of the Green Revolution was genetically modified crops. Genetically modified crops inevitably lead to superweeds. Many weeds have now evolved to become resistant to Roundup. Many farmers have no choice but yet to use even more and more of the toxic substance. What's more is there is controversy surrounding human health with regards to the ingesting of GMOs. Scientists have recently discovered a mycotoxic pathogen that is present in GMO crops like corn, soy, and wheat. This can lead to infertility and miscarriage in the livestock and people who ingest it. Livestock that is fed genetically modified feed can suffer from an up to 50% loss in fertility. Some scientists speculate that this may be the cause of the worldwide drop in fertility. Just like the plotline in the movie Interstellar, many scientists are warning that many crops are facing a serious existential threat from fungal disease. Wheat rust is a devastating disease which is commonly referred to as the polio of agriculture. Fungal diseases like this destroy nearly 20% of crops every year. And just like pesticide resistance and herbicide resistance and antibiotic resistance, there is also antifungal resistance. According to an international team of researchers at the Imperial College of London, the emergence of resistance is leading to a deterioration of our ability to defend our crops against fungal pathogens. The annual losses for food production has serious implications for food security on a global scale. And the problem with these fungal diseases is that they spread very fast, meaning that it's very hard to contain the problem, especially when everybody's growing the exact same strain of crop. Although not of the fungal variety, the parasite that afflicted Irish crops between 1845 and 1849 caused what is known as the Great Famine, killing nearly 3 million people. Wholesale dependency on staple crops led to nearly 25% of the Irish population being wiped out by this famine. Biodiversity is a defense against superpathogens. Nearly 98% of vegetable varieties that used to be grown and consumed locally have disappeared over the past century. What's more is that 50% of the crops grown around the world are corn, rice, and wheat. And to put monoculture in perspective even more, 75% of all the calories ingested by human beings are from 12 different types of crops. This drastic reduction in biodiversity has allowed for a controlled set of conditions which has enabled us to mass produce the amount of food required by 7.5 billion people. However, this homogeneous agricultural practice leaves us much more vulnerable to superpathogens, because it's biodiversity which allows for the positive mutations to take place that make crops more resilient to these threats. The saying, "the bigger they are, the harder they fall," could not be a more fitting statement for modern agriculture. When there is no genetic variation in a crop, it becomes a prime breeding ground for pathogens, which will spread through it like wildfire. While calories in diets have been increasing across the board the world over throughout the 20th century, there has been shown to be an inverse relationship with the amount of nutrients in that food. Basically, more calories but less nutrients. Food must now be fortified with vitamins and minerals in order to meet nutritional guidelines. Presently, it is thought that over 2 billion people in the world are nutrient deficient in some way, shape, or form. The reasons for these nutrient deficiencies are multifold. One of these reasons is that food crops have been grown to be bigger and bigger in size, and they also grow much more rapidly. Unfortunately, their ability to manufacture and uptake nutrients from the soil doesn't keep pace with their rapid growth. So that gigantic strawberry that you bought from the grocery store today is not nutritionally equivalent in weight to its progenitor. The food that big agriculture creates is all breadth and no depth. Whether it's calcium, magnesium, zinc, vitamin B6, vitamin C, and vitamin E have been shown to be diminished in certain fruits and vegetables up to 30%. However, there's some extreme outliers. For instance, in the case of oranges, one study concluded that you would have to eat 8 oranges to derive the same amount of vitamin A as your grandparents did from 1. It has also been found that higher atmospheric levels of CO2 have resulted in less nutritious crop yields, with concentrations of protein, iron, and zinc being nearly 17% lower when crops are grown in environments with CO2 concentrations of 550 parts per million versus crops grown under atmospheric conditions in which CO2 levels are at 400 parts per million. In addition, because of soil depletion and erosion and the very thin layer of topsoil that remains, the depletion of nutrients in these soils has been passed on to the fruits and vegetables that we consume. Essentially, what it amounts to is that we are producing more and more food, but we are not producing more and more nutrients. The 10 hottest years on record have happened within the last 20 years. Ocean temperatures as well as ground level temperatures have increased significantly over the past 150 years. And when winters don't get cold enough and are more short-lived, they don't kill off the pests, which can wreak havoc on crops in the summertime. If it's not heat and drought and topsoil erosion, it's flooding and extreme temperature fluctuations, polar vortices, and heat domes. According to a 2011 National Academy of Sciences report, for every degree Celsius that global temperature rises, there'll be a 15% reduction in crop production. Considering that the Trump administration acknowledges a potential 7-degree rise in global average temperature this century, do the math. The prognosis is bad. A common misconception is that because plants like CO2, that there's going to be increased crop yields. Unfortunately, the wild weather fluctuations caused by increased warming lead to the aforementioned climate anomalies, which put significant stress on crops and cancel out any gains made from increased CO2 in the atmosphere. In addition, as previously stated, plants who are grown in a higher CO2 environment are also more nutrient deficient. As evidenced this year with the proverbial polar vortex, the jet stream has the ability to greatly alter weather patterns and thus significantly impact crop production. Europe seen one of its worst droughts in 2018, California is running out of water, and the grain belt of the United States is bleeding the non-replenishable aquifers dry. Meteorologists have forecasted that the next 5 years are projected to be the hottest on record. Since the last ice age, the glaciers have been in retreat. The retreat of these glaciers since the year 1850 has a profound effect on the availability of fresh water for irrigation. The natural cyclical occurrence of retreating glaciers means less water for the vital waterways on which farms around the world rely. The speed at which the glaciers are melting is only accelerated by anthropogenic global warming. A prime example of this situation is the Colorado River. Many cities which rely on it for sustenance are already making contingency plans for when it inevitably dries up. Aquifers around the world are being depleted and contaminated by mining practices. 10% of the crops that are grown around the world are irrigated by groundwater, which is non-renewable. Aquifers are being drained faster than they are refilling. For example, the Ogalla Aquifer, which is one of the largest in the world, is what supplies irrigation to the better part of the US grain belt. This is one of the largest wheat-producing regions of the world, supplying food for much of the United States and 15% which is exported throughout the world. This single aquifer supplies 30% of all the groundwater in the United States. When this water eventually runs out, one of the largest wheat-producing regions in the world is not going to be able to produce food. 16% of all the animal protein consumed by human beings comes from the ocean. Nearly 90 million tons of fish is harvested from the oceans every year. For comparison, fish farming is one of the fastest growing industries. With 8% year-over-year growth, nearly 80 million tons of fish is harvested in this way. Monoculture rules still apply to overfishing. A reduction in biodiversity in the oceans due to a 39% drop in aquatic species over the last 40 years. This is all exacerbated by rising ocean temperatures, which have contributed to innumerable amounts of fish kills around the world. In addition to this, there has been a higher demand for the pescatarian lifestyle, translating into 17% of the fish stocks worldwide being overexploited and unsustainable, 52% being fully exploited and unsustainable, and 7% are already depleted. Approximately 90% of all large predatory fish stocks are already gone. Overfishing has disproportionately targeted fish who are at the top of the food chain, and as explained before, through a process called bioamplification of toxins, are the most toxic of them all. Of the Earth's 57 million square miles, approximately 12 million miles of that is arable land. Most of that is already in use, and what isn't in use provides other vital planetary functions, like the rainforest. Even though only 20% of the Amazon rainforest has been destroyed, we need to remember that as CO2 emissions rise, this flora is what scrubs the atmosphere of our refuse. So the problem of CO2 emissions is drastically compounded by the conversion of the Amazon rainforest into farmland and human habitat, and the same trend can be found in what remains of the other great forests of the world. This is but one of many positive reinforcing feedback loops, which many climatologists believe is going to cause an abrupt and irreversible climate change, which will lead to a rapid warming of the planet due to a cascade of variables which collectively work to warm the planet at a rapid rate. So just because there are very large areas of sub-Saharan Africa and South America which have not been developed, doesn't mean that converting this land into vegetable, fruit, and grain crops is going to be sustainable. Between 1947 and 2005, the number of honeybees in the United States declined over 40%. The crisis only continues to escalate. It is projected that if colony collapse disorder continues on this trajectory, there will be no bees in existence in the United States of America by 2035. If there are no bees left, there are no pollinators. If there are no pollinators, we don't eat. Unfortunately, big agriculture has now locked itself into a system where it relies on pesticides in order to grow food. This is going to continue to destroy one of the primary pollinating species that we rely on for our food. So the gist of this whole talk is, there's more people who have bigger and bigger appetites, and our capability to meet those needs grows smaller and smaller by the day as the environment deteriorates and the energy we require to do it becomes more and more. Many people will be bothered by the fact that within this video I did not focus a lot on solutions. But my personal belief is that there is only one real solution, and that solution is to grow your own food. Something which is going to be at the top of my priority list for 2019. Please show your support by liking, commenting, and sharing this video on other social media platforms. Everything that I've said in this video can be fact-checked, and sharing this video with other people may just inspire them to initiate their own horticultural lifestyle. Thanks for watching Canadian Prepper Out. The best way to support this YouTube channel is to support yourself by gearing up through CanadianPreparedness.com or BugOutRoll.ca. Premium quality gear at the best possible price using the incredibly secure and easy to use Shopify platform. We offer free shipping to the United States for orders over $200 USD and free shipping to Canada over $75. So support the channel by supporting yourself.